Hello and welcome back to Healthy Spouse, Healthy House. My name is Tony and my channel focuses on health, wellness, and relationships. I believe that there are 15 different areas of health that any one person can work on at any point in time in their lives. So each week I ask you to join me as I introduce, define, and discuss each one of those areas of health. And then in the end, y'all, we make plans and we make goals so that we can become healthier in those areas. Now, last week I did a video on racial health versus cultural health, and or nature versus nurture is what I like to call it. And I was just trying to give you an understanding of the differences between race and culture. Now, and so in that video, I was also introducing racial health, but I was like, I need to expound on racial health just a little bit more so you guys can understand where I'm coming from when I mention the term racial health. But anyway, so if you want to know more about my views on that topic, you can watch my previous video. But the purpose of this discussion is to give you a little more information on racial health itself. And in order to do so, we're going to define race again, we're going to define racism again, and we're going to define racial health again in this video. So anyway, race is groups that humans are divided into based on physical traits regarded as common among people of shared ancestry. It's your genetics. It's the physical and biological traits passed on through generations. It's how you look, right? It's who you are, what you made of. What are you made of, right? So that's race. Now, racism is defined as, and I expounded on this particular definition too. Racism is defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, community, or institution against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. Racism also involves systems that consist of structures, policies, practices, norms, and beliefs that assign value and determine opportunity based on the way a person look or the color of their skin. So that's racism defined. And lastly, let's define racial health. So just like the last video, I defined racial health as void of racism. So what you want to do, you want to go back and read what racism is, and you want to not do that. You want to be void of all of that, whatever that is, racism. And then also I added something to racial health. We want to have and promote positive racial identity. And we'll talk more about that later, but that's what we want to do. So racial health is void of racism, also having a positive racial identity. So y'all, race is something we can't change. We need to embrace it. It's a part of us. It's who we are. It's who we're made of, literally. Okay, so anyway, now let's move on to systems. Now, when I defined racism and racial health, I mentioned the word systems, right? And you see the word systems in the title. So systems, stereotypes, and symptoms. So when I defined racism and racial health, I mentioned systems. And unfortunately, many systems have been put into place in this country with racism being just embedded, just being all up in there within the very core of our major institutions. And again, like I said, y'all, that is unfortunate, especially for people of color. And this is how we come up with systemic racism. And systemic racism is defined as policies and practices that exist throughout a whole society or organization, and that results in and supports a continued unfair advantage to some people and unfair or harmful treatment of others based on race. Now, systemic racism affects how people of color are treated by our justice system. It affects housing, education, healthcare, hiring processes, and so many other things. And one major example of systemic racism is like the Jim Crow laws, right? And they were enforced. And when I was looking this up, I was like, what? The Jim Crow laws were enforced until 1965. Many of us still have relatives. Some of us were living during that time, but many of us still have relatives that were living during the Jim Crow law era. And it's like, that was in 1965. So anyway, where it, ceased to exist. But anyway, these laws legalized racial segregation and were meant to marginalize African Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, etc. Like, although these laws were written down, y'all, these were actual laws that were written, right? We know that there are so many laws that are practiced but aren't written down. There's no documentation of other types of laws that people go by. So anyway, aside from systemic racism, there are 5 other types of racism that goes on. And whew, when I tell you, as I was doing the research, it was just like, my eyes were open because, when you're going through these things and you're looking at these things, you can think of so many different examples of these types of racism. And even, coming from my own experiences and experiences that I've shared with other people. So anyway, let's just continue on. So another form of racism is internalized racism. And this is the racism that describes when victims of racism through coercion or conditioning turn racist attitudes against themselves or their racial or ethnic group. This involves using racist terms against other members of the same racial or ethnic group, and also involves placing like higher values on members who appear or act more like the dominant group. And one example of that is, a person that may suppress aspects of their racialization, in whatever way, maybe with their hair or with their makeup or, with their features and things like that. Or maybe their accent, just different things like that. And another example is you can look up the Dr. Kenneth and Mamie Clark doll test. That's something that you can look up. That's an example of internalized racism too, something that you can look up and research. So anyway, another form of racism is interpersonal racism. And this is racism that occurs between individuals, like 2 people. It is the biased response that occurs when individuals interact with others that are considered racially different than themselves. Now, this includes microaggressions. Yeah, and y'all know what microaggressions are. These are comments or actions that subtly or sometimes unconsciously or unintentionally express a prejudiced attitude toward a member of a marginalized group. An example of that is, someone not getting hired because of the way that they style their hair, like braids or afros, or something like that. So another example or another form of racism is individual racism. And this is prejudgment, bias, or discrimination by an individual based on race, color, national origin, or ethnicity. And this is the beliefs and actions of individuals that support or perpetuate racism, unfair or harmful behavior, or beliefs or actions from one person directed against another person. And for this, an example of individual racism is a parent that may not let their child play with another child because of the other child's race. So let's move on to the next form, which is institutional racism. And this is a form of racism that is embedded in the laws and regulations of a society or organization. So now we're getting, to the bigger ones, to where it's not necessarily dealing with person to person, but actually into the actual way something works. So this is, again, institutional racism is a form of racism that is embedded in the laws and regulations of a society or organization. The generalized discrimination against an entire racial group that has been incorporated into a public or social system like our criminal justice system, education, and healthcare. One of those examples is like racial profiling in law enforcement. Lastly, structural racism. And this describes the way our systems are structured to produce racial inequalities between whites and people of color. And an example of that is a judge that gives a lengthier sentence to a person of color than their white counterpart with the same charges. So these are all forms of racism that have to be addressed and looked into. And it starts with you as the individual. Each area of health starts with you and your example. Anyway, meet me in my next video so we can we can finish this conversation on racial health. And I will see you guys in the next one, part 2. All right. Bye.